I wouldn't have said so, no. Not really. But no, I don't get the feeling that she's wildly optimistic about life. A pragmatist, I think.
The room had been prepared for a routine royal briefing. No one expected Princess Anne to turn it into a moment of reckoning. Yet when she placed both hands on the table, looked directly toward Camilla, and declared, "Camilla will never lead where the Queen led," every conversation stopped. Charles did not move. William lowered his eyes, and the Queen Consort suddenly understood that this was not criticism whispered behind closed doors. It was a boundary announced before witnesses. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne held Camilla's gaze and refused to soften the meaning. The private leadership meeting at Windsor Castle had brought together Charles, William, Sophie, senior household officials, and the two women now facing each other across the table. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, clarified that ceremonial rank did not grant the Queen Consort control over Queen Elizabeth's personal traditions, family loyalties, or legacy institutions. Camilla remained still as every face turned toward her. She slowly removed her glasses, placed them beside an unopened folder, and asked Anne whether she had intended to humiliate her before the household. The Queen's voice stayed controlled, but the pain beneath it was impossible to hide. This was more than a disagreement over duties. Anne had publicly separated the authority of a sovereign from the influence of a consort, meaning the spouse of a reigning monarch. Charles tightened his fingers around the arm of his chair. The king looked toward his sister with anger, yet his response faltered before it formed. Defending Camilla too forcefully would make Anne's warning appear justified. Remaining silent, however, left his wife exposed. He had spent months trying to preserve unity, but that caution had allowed distrust to grow beneath every carefully managed conversation. Anne opened the handwritten page she had brought with her. She named 3 areas where Camilla had attempted to extend her influence: memorial arrangements, patronage assignments, and Queen Elizabeth's private anniversary observances. A royal patronage is an official connection through which a royal supports a charity or public cause. Anne insisted these decisions were not harmless details. They shaped who controlled memory, loyalty, and the emotional center of the family. William did not challenge her. The future king already knew what was coming, because Anne had warned him privately before the meeting that she intended to draw a permanent line around the late monarch's legacy. His silence revealed concern, not surprise. But to understand why Anne was willing to wound her brother's wife so publicly, the palace first had to confront what each person in that room feared losing. Behind Anne's declaration stood 4 private struggles. Camilla wanted proof that years of sacrifice had finally earned her trust. Charles wanted peace between the woman he loved and the family he inherited. William feared that his grandmother's legacy was being rewritten too quickly. And Anne, carrying decades of silent duty, believed she was watching the monarchy confuse acceptance with succession. The battle was not simply over influence. It was over who had the right to define what the crown remembered. Anne carried her mother's example like a private oath. She had spent a lifetime watching Queen Elizabeth serve with restraint, absorb pressure without complaint, and protect continuity even when it demanded personal sacrifice. That history mattered because the Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, believed leadership was not measured by proximity to the throne, but by the burden a person could carry without reshaping the institution around themselves. To her, the late Queen's legacy was not a collection of ceremonies. It was a discipline, and she feared that discipline was being softened into symbolism. Camilla carried a different wound. The Queen Consort, the wife of a reigning king, had endured years of hostility before she was finally accepted near the center of royal life. She believed that standing beside Charles through public criticism, private instability, and family strain had earned her a meaningful voice. That history mattered because every suggestion that she remained permanently secondary reopened old insecurity. When Anne drew that line at Windsor, the monarch's wife did not hear a warning about tradition alone. She heard the return of every doubt she thought she had outlived. Charles felt the pressure from both sides, and satisfied neither. Behind a closed door after the meeting, Camilla asked why he had allowed his sister's words to stand. The king tried to explain that contradicting Anne before senior officials would have created a larger crisis, especially at a moment when the household was already tense. She heard only hesitation. His silence, she told him, had made the humiliation official. He wanted peace, but peace without clarity had become its own form of damage. William felt no peace at all. The prince respected the support Camilla had given his father, yet he believed some traditions belonged to Queen Elizabeth and should pass through the sovereign and direct heir, rather than through a consort's household. He had rewritten his notes 3 times before the Windsor meeting to avoid taking sides openly, but his silence had not come from uncertainty. It came from knowing exactly how dangerous the truth had become. Sophie noticed what the others missed. The trusted confidant heard Anne's tone sharpen each time Camilla spoke about my role going forward, and she understood the fear beneath it. This was no longer just about present duties. It was about whether influence could slowly harden into permanent authority. And once the palace returned to one altered memorial ceremony that had first convinced Anne something deeper was changing, everything at Windsor began to look less like an outburst and more like an overdue alarm. And once the palace returned to that ceremony, the statement at Windsor no longer looked sudden. It looked like the delayed explosion of a warning nobody had wanted to hear. The path to Anne's shocking statement began not with a crown, a title, or a public argument, but with a memorial service. It was meant to honor Queen Elizabeth through the traditions she had personally protected. Instead, one altered passage, one removed family tribute, and one quiet instruction from Camilla's office transformed the ceremony into a private point of no return. Anne said nothing that day, but as the final hymn ended, she had already decided the silence could not continue. Anne discovered the change shortly before the private anniversary service at St. George's Chapel, 3 months before the confrontation at Windsor. The chapel is a historic royal place of worship, where major family ceremonies and memorials are often held. A spoken tribute, recalling her mother's lifelong promise of service, had disappeared from the final order. The printed program, setting out the ceremony's prayers, readings, and music. In its place stood a broader passage praising the continuing partnership of the king and queen in guiding the monarchy. Anne held the revised paper beside the chapel entrance and demanded to know who had approved it. Camilla's private secretary explained that the present reign needed greater emphasis and that the Queen Consort had supported the alteration. A private secretary is a senior official who manages a royal household's work and advice. The Princess Royal folded the page once, returned it, and entered without another word. Her restraint looked calm. Inside, anger had already begun hardening into resolve. William watched Anne's expression change when the replacement passage was read aloud. The prince saw her jaw tighten, yet she never looked toward Camilla. She stared ahead, grieving more than the missing words. What wounded her was the ease with which a message personally tied to Queen Elizabeth had been removed, then replaced by language that seemed to advance another household's authority. Sophie uncovered the deeper problem after the service. Neither Anne nor William had received the final wording, even though both had been expected to participate. The revision had passed through Charles's household and Camilla's office without consultation with those closest to the late monarch's private legacy. The trusted confidant understood immediately why the silence around the change felt more dangerous than the change itself. Anne received a second notice 2 days later. Future memorial planning would be handled through a new joint committee, an administrative group created to coordinate decisions, with daily control given to an official from the Queen Consort's household. One painful edit now looked like the beginning of a larger transfer of influence. Anne requested a private explanation. Camilla answered through a documented written response that the monarchy had entered a new reign and could not preserve every preference of the old one. Those words remained with the princess until Windsor, where grief finally became confrontation. When Anne and Camilla finally stood face to face, the argument was no longer about a missing tribute. It was about whether honoring the past had become an obstacle to someone else's future. The meeting should have ended after Anne's first statement. Instead, Camilla pushed back. She leaned forward and demanded to know whether the Princess Royal believed she should remain silent, decorative, and permanently apologetic. Anne's reply came without hesitation. "You may stand beside the king, but you cannot inherit the queen's place." Charles rose so quickly that his chair struck the wall. Yet even the sound of wood against stone could not stop what had finally broken loose between the two women. Camilla gathered the pages before her, but her hands betrayed the control in her voice. She insisted she had never claimed to replace Queen Elizabeth, and accused Anne of turning routine household decisions into an attack on the late monarch's memory. The Queen Consort, the wife of a reigning king, argued that her title carried responsibilities, not merely ceremonial appearances. She had served beside Charles through strain and criticism, yet the family seemed willing to value that service only while it remained invisible. Anne refused to retreat. The Princess Royal said supporting the sovereign was legitimate, but directing memorial traditions, influencing patronages connected to the heir, and controlling access to her mother's private customs crossed a permanent boundary. A royal patronage is an official relationship through which a family member supports a charity or cause. Anne insisted that authority over Queen Elizabeth's personal legacy belonged collectively to Charles, William, and the late sovereign's children, not to one household acting through administrative convenience. Camilla's restraint finally cracked. She told Anne that the family accepted her help when it needed stability, then questioned her motives whenever she exercised the duties attached to her position. For the first time, she admitted what years of formal smiles had concealed. She felt tolerated, not trusted. Anne heard the pain but did not withdraw the warning. Charles struck the table and ordered them both to stop. The king accused his sister of forcing him to choose between his wife and his family. Anne answered quietly that the choice had already been created by decisions he had failed to challenge. Her words landed harder than the blow of his palm, because Charles knew silence had protected the arrangement until the conflict became unavoidable. William finally entered the argument. The prince confirmed that he had objected to the memorial committee, an administrative group created to manage anniversary planning. He rejected Anne's harshest language, but supported her demand that his grandmother's private legacy remain beyond Camilla's operational control. Camilla then opened her folder and produced the authorization. Charles's handwritten approval appeared beneath the disputed revisions. The king stared at his own signature, and the entire argument changed. Anne's accusation no longer stopped with Camilla. It reached the monarch himself. The confrontation had revealed the wound, but the signature on Camilla's page revealed something more dangerous. Behind the emotional battle stood an unresolved question of who truly held the power to decide. Charles's signature appeared decisive, but the palace machinery told a more complicated story. A sovereign could approve ceremonies, committees, and household arrangements. Yet personal foundations, private family traditions, and legacy instructions did not automatically belong to the crown. As officials separated royal authority from inherited responsibility, Camilla waited alone in an adjoining room. For perhaps the first time since becoming Queen Consort, she realized that a title could place her at the center of the monarchy without granting control over its deepest memory. Charles ordered an immediate review of the disputed powers. The Lord Chamberlain, the senior official responsible for coordinating major royal ceremonial duties, joined private secretaries and legacy trustees to examine the memorial committee's authority. Trustees are appointed people responsible for protecting an organization, fund, or written instruction. The officials separated events formally controlled by the sovereign from commemorations created through Queen Elizabeth's personal wishes, family agreements, and independent charitable structures. That distinction mattered because one belonged to the present reign, while the other carried obligations that could not simply be transferred through marriage. Anne's argument gained institutional weight as the review continued. Camilla could advise the king and participate in official planning, but her household could not automatically control private memorial foundations or family commemorations linked to the late queen. Consultation with designated representatives was required. What Anne had expressed through anger was now being confirmed through procedure. Camilla sat alone and removed a ring from her finger. She turned it slowly and asked an aide whether everyone believed she had become ambitious. The Queen's voice carried more fear than accusation. The aide hesitated, searching for a careful answer, but the pause lasted too long. Camilla understood that doubt had already entered the household, and silence wounded her more deeply than a direct charge. Charles faced a harsher truth elsewhere. The king reread the authorization bearing his signature and remembered approving it during a crowded week without questioning its wider meaning. His anger toward Anne began shifting into guilt. Camilla had acted under permission he had provided, and his carelessness had placed his wife at the center of a conflict she had not created alone. The trustees then produced a sealed memorandum, a private written instruction preserved for future use. Queen Elizabeth had stated that commemorations centered on her personal service should remain protected from the changing preferences of future households. The document named no one, yet its warning was unmistakable. William received a formal role under the same instruction. Responsibility belonged to the sovereign, the direct heir, and representatives of the late Queen's children, limiting any consort's independent office. Charles now faced a humiliating choice: defend what he had approved, or restructure it, and confirm Anne's warning. The boundary had been found in writing, but documents could not contain the damage because by the following morning, doors were closing, duties were changing, and Camilla could feel the new reality taking shape around her. The consequences did not arrive with a dramatic proclamation. They appeared through altered schedules, cancelled briefings, and names quietly removed from planning lists. Camilla's representative was withdrawn from the memorial committee. William was added. Anne received authority to review every future tribute connected to Queen Elizabeth's private legacy. By breakfast, the Queen Consort could see the palace reorganizing itself around the very boundary she had resisted. The confrontation was over, but its verdict had begun entering every room before anyone dared speak it aloud. Charles approved a revised structure before the household began its morning work. Memorial planning would now be shared between the sovereign, William, Anne, and independent trustees. A trustee is someone formally responsible for protecting an organization, fund, or written legacy. Camilla retained a ceremonial role, allowing her to attend and support commemorations, but her office could no longer direct the committee. The change protected the late Queen's private wishes, while placing a visible limit around the Queen Consort's institutional reach. Camilla received the revised schedule from her private secretary. 3 meetings had been reassigned, and several briefing notes now listed her as a participant rather than a decision-maker. She scanned the pages, closed the cover, and said, "They have made me a guest in a role I was told to carry." Anger flashed first, then exhaustion replaced it. She had fought for acceptance for years, only to discover that acceptance could still vanish the moment authority became contested. Anne felt no victory. Sophie told the Princess Royal that she had protected an essential boundary, but the monarch's sister answered that defending the crown should never require making another woman feel publicly diminished. Her warning had been necessary, yet the damage troubled her. Anne had wanted clarity, not humiliation, and she now feared the family would remember the wound more clearly than the reason behind it. Charles turned his frustration toward William. The king accused his son of allowing Anne to dominate the confrontation and harden a disagreement into a crisis. The prince replied that the crisis began when his father confused defending Camilla as a wife with granting her household permanent institutional reach. Charles turned away instead of answering, because the distinction exposed the failure he still could not comfortably name. Camilla then instructed her staff to prepare a list of duties she could surrender without disrupting the king's program. The request frightened Charles. Her withdrawal could reduce public tension, but it could also deepen the private distance already growing between them. Anne intervened before any announcement could be made. She sent Camilla a handwritten note requesting a meeting alone, without Charles, William, advisors, secretaries, or witnesses. After days of arguments conducted through titles and official powers, the future of the relationship now depended on 2 women entering the same room with nothing between them except grief, pride, and the truth. Anne chose a small room with no long table, no files, and no seats arranged by rank. Camilla arrived alone and remained standing near the door, uncertain whether the invitation was an apology or another warning. The Princess Royal did not repeat her public accusation. Instead, she said, "I was defending my mother, but I spoke as though you had no wounds of your own." For the first time since the conflict began, Camilla's expression softened, not because the boundary had disappeared, but because someone had finally acknowledged its human cost. Anne asked her to sit, and promised that nothing said between them would become a formal statement or return through rival households. A royal household is the group of advisors and staff who organize a senior family member's duties. For once, neither woman would be protected by titles, secretaries, or prepared language. Camilla accepted, though the Queen Consort remained guarded. She had entered expecting another judgment. Instead, she found grief waiting across from her. Anne admitted that every change connected to Queen Elizabeth felt like another piece of her mother being taken away. The memorial revision had awakened a fear she could no longer control, that history would be softened, modernized, and slowly replaced, until the woman she mourned survived only as a symbol. The Princess Royal said her anger had come from love, but love had not excused the cruelty of making Camilla feel worthless. Camilla answered with an honesty she had withheld from Charles. She had never expected to become another Elizabeth, yet she was exhausted by being asked to serve fully while exercising influence cautiously. The Queen said Anne's declaration had made her believe no amount of loyalty could ever overcome the past. She could stand beside the king, carry public duties, and endure criticism, but still remain permanently suspected whenever she acted with confidence. Anne apologized for turning a boundary into a verdict on Camilla's worth. She did not withdraw the boundary itself. Her mother's personal traditions could not be controlled by one household, however trusted. Camilla accepted the apology and admitted the memorial wording should never have changed without consulting Anne and William. Camilla then revealed that she had not written the replacement passage. A senior advisor had proposed it to strengthen the image of the present reign. She approved it because rejecting the wording might have made her appear uncertain in her role. Fear, not conquest, had guided the decision, but fear had still caused harm. Together, they found a path forward. Camilla would support national commemorations, while Anne and William protected Queen Elizabeth's private traditions. Future choices would require consultation, never assumption. Inside that quiet room, the anger had finally found its truth. But beyond the palace gates, Anne's words were becoming a headline, a judgment, and a symbol far larger than either woman intended. By noon, the private words spoken at Windsor had escaped into public life. Television panels repeated them. Commentators argued over them. Crowds outside royal residences debated whether Anne had defended Queen Elizabeth or wounded Camilla beyond fairness. Yet one image came to define the day. A newspaper front page showing the late Queen on the balcony beside a solitary photograph of the Queen Consort, divided by the headline, "She will never lead where Elizabeth led." The family's private grief had become Britain's public verdict. Broadcasters called Anne's statement the clearest internal definition yet of Camilla's limits. Some presented it as a defense of constitutional hierarchy, the order that separates the authority of the sovereign from the supporting role of a consort. Others saw proof that old wounds still lived beneath the monarchy's carefully managed unity. The palace answered with controlled language, confirming that Queen Elizabeth's personal commemorations would be overseen collaboratively. It praised Camilla's continuing support for Charles, but did not deny the words spoken at Windsor. That silence effectively confirmed the boundary. Charles watched the coverage from his private office until the sentence was replayed once more. The king switched off the television before the panel discussion began and told an aide that his family had turned a correct institutional distinction into a personal humiliation. He understood Anne's concern, yet he could not ignore the damage done to his wife. Camilla refused to disappear. Advisors urged the Queen Consort to cancel a literacy reception, warning that every expression would be examined for signs of defeat. She attended anyway. When a young volunteer offered her flowers, Camilla thanked the girl and continued the engagement. Her composure did not erase the pain, but it prevented the headline from defining her entire day. Public sympathy divided outside Buckingham Palace. An elderly woman placed a small photograph of Queen Elizabeth near the railings beside a handwritten card reading, "Her duty cannot be inherited, only honored." Minutes later, another visitor added flowers, with a message supporting Camilla. The palace gates became a symbol of two emotions existing at once: loyalty to the late monarch and compassion for the woman accused of reaching too far. Anne recognized that the story had become crueler than her intention. The Princess Royal authorized a documented clarification, stating that her warning concerned leadership over her mother's personal legacy, not Camilla's worth or service. She protected the boundary, while rejecting total condemnation. Charles then summoned Anne, Camilla, and William again. This time, the king would announce the final arrangement and decide what the sentence meant inside the monarchy. The world had turned Anne's warning into a contest between two queens, but the final meeting would reveal that the true verdict was not about replacing one woman with another, it was about learning where memory ends and duty begins. The final meeting began in the same room where the conflict had erupted, but nothing felt the same. Anne no longer arrived prepared for battle. Camilla no longer carried the disputed committee papers. William sat beside Charles rather than across from him. The king looked at each of them and delivered a decision that ended the argument. Queen Elizabeth's personal legacy would remain protected by her children, the sovereign, and the direct heir, while Camilla would serve the present reign without being asked or permitted to become its imitation of the past. Charles spoke without hiding behind advisors or cautious palace language. Anne and William would jointly oversee Queen Elizabeth's private commemorative traditions alongside independent trustees, people legally responsible for protecting an organization, fund, or written legacy. Camilla would continue participating in national services as Queen Consort, the title held by the wife of a reigning king, but her household would not direct customs or institutions created through the late monarch's personal authority. The boundary was now permanent, clear, and impossible to reinterpret. Charles then made the distinction the family had avoided for too long. Camilla's service belonged to the present reign, while his mother's legacy belonged to history, family, and the crown collectively. One role supported the monarchy as it existed now, the other preserved the memory of a sovereign whose 70 years of duty could never be repeated. Neither responsibility diminished the other, but neither could consume it. Charles turned first toward his wife. The king admitted that his careless authorization had placed her in a position she should never have been forced to defend. He then faced Anne and acknowledged that failing to consult her had made his sister believe their mother's wishes were being quietly erased. His desire to avoid conflict had created the very confrontation he feared. Camilla accepted the limit without argument. The Queen Consort told Anne she would no longer seek operational control over private memorial planning. She asked only that her years beside Charles be judged on their own terms rather than measured endlessly against Queen Elizabeth's reign. Anne finally redefined the sentence that had shaken the palace. Camilla would never lead where the Queen led, because no one could. Elizabeth's path belonged to a sovereign, shaped by singular duty, sacrifice, and time. The Princess Royal had not meant to declare another woman worthless. She had meant to declare her mother irreplaceable. Anne moved her chair back, crossed the room, and placed her hand briefly over Camilla's. "Serve beside him as yourself," she said. The Queen nodded, and Charles finally released the breath he had been holding. And with that final distinction, the palace closed the argument completely. Camilla would help Charles shape the reign before them, while Queen Elizabeth's place, untouched, unmatched, and permanently protected, would remain her own. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.